We're delighted and privileged this evening to have with us Dr. James Watson for this very special centenary event. And also it's a great pleasure to welcome his wife Elizabeth, who's also here. It's great to see so many people. As you can imagine, the next door theatre is also packed, and then we have people in the marquee. So it's a great pleasure that so many people have come along to listen to Jim this evening. And I'm sure there isn't a single person here who doesn't know that Jim, working with Francis Crick, put together the final pieces that finally cracked the structure of DNA. And I'm certain that in 1953, no one truly understood just how important that revelation was, nor what impact it would have on science and society in the future. In 1989, Jim commented, "When finally interpreted, the genetic messages encoded within our DNA molecules will provide the ultimate answers to the chemical underpinnings of human existence." And as we get nearer and nearer to such answers, we realize that new possibilities for healthcare management emerge. But so do ethical and logistical problems. And I'm sure many of you read in Nature last week that Jim is one of the first people to be given a map of his own genome. But then Jim opted to have certain information removed from that disk. And no doubt others will wish to make such choices in the future for their own peace of mind or, of course, economic security. So we also see dilemmas being debated about how to use the best of stem cell research and at the same time avoid undesirable abuses. We all appreciate that development in science brings forth comfort and discomfort. And it's therefore essential that we recognize the need for discussion and dialogue before we make rules around emerging and new technologies. So what better person could we have to discuss and talk to us about such matters than Jim? Also with us this evening is Matt Ridley, a science journalist who's worked as a science editor of The Economist and later as a columnist of the Daily Telegraph. His books have sold over 500,000 copies and have been translated into 26 languages, as well as being shortlisted for 6 literary prizes. Last year, Matt published his biography of the late Francis Crick, who of course was Jim's scientific partner. And Matt has been instrumental in setting up this event this evening, and we're very grateful to Matt for doing that. So ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to James Watson and Matt Ridley to discuss rules for important science. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me describe 3 kinds of scientific career. The first kind is the sort where you make a truly great discovery out of the blue at the age of 25, sparking a revolution that utterly changes not only science but other walks of life as well. You win the Nobel Prize. The second kind is where you write a truly great textbook defining your field, and then you go on to write a great popular book about science, a groundbreaking non-fiction novel that sells more than 1 million copies. The third kind is where at a young age you become the head of department at a great university, attract a brilliant team to work with you, then leave to revive and run a famous independent laboratory using your talent for fundraising to turn it into one of the most respected institutions in the field. You then take on a government job as head of an unprecedented international scientific project, radically altering its direction. You win an honorary knighthood from the Queen. Any one of these careers would be remarkable enough, but Jim Watson has had all 3. He discovered the structure of DNA in 1953 with Francis Crick. He wrote the double helix in 1969, and he was the first head of the Human Genome Project starting in 1988. He's now written another volume of his memoirs, and I've had a sneak preview of it, and we're going to hear a bit more about it tonight, although it's not published for another few months. It has the splendid double entendre title, Avoid Boring People. He's going to speak for about 10 or 20 minutes about the rules he has drawn from his career about how to do important science. He'll then subject himself to my questions, and then I hope to yours. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll hand over to Jim Watson.
I ran the Human Genome Project for 4 years until I was fired by the new head of NIH, and Bernadine Healy. And I guess our conflict was basically she thought of DNA as making money, and I didn't want any patents. Anyways, I got fired, and suddenly I had a summer where I didn't have 2 jobs, and what was I going to do? So I thought, well, I'll start my autobiography. So I went back to Chicago and read the speeches of the President Robert Hutchins, got my transcript and saw what sort of grades I actually got, and began writing it. That was 1992. The book is going to come out 15 years later. It took quite a while to finish it. And about halfway through it, I began at the end of chapters putting rules, which I didn't have at the time, but why I managed, to get into the university. What did I do right in grammar school? Okay. Or what did I do right as an assistant professor to get promoted? Or what did I do right when I wrote successful books? So there's that, so there were a series of rules, and I can tell you the first rule, which was from boyhood, which is avoid fighting bigger boys or dogs. If you don't win. So I think a rule which I've had is don't get into a fight which you're going to lose. Sometimes you're going to have to get into fights, but just win. Okay. Another rule which I got from my father was only accept truth which comes from experience, observation, or experiment. Nothing from revelation. So, you have to have a reason before believing it, all right? And I need not dwell on the fact that my father had no use for religion. So that was a very useful thing. You had to have a reason for believing something, not that someone else believed in it. Okay, and then when I got to college, a good rule was ideas are more important than facts. Basically, put everything together with an idea. And the University of Chicago was a wonderful place for thinking about ideas because the curriculum, at least for your initial years, was based around great books and great ideas, not facts. Textbooks were sort of out. You were to, and then when I think back on when I became a research student, the most important rule was choose a young thesis advisor. That has never worked for the head of the department. And the basic reason for that is that you want to get into a new field. And you don't want to be someone's 25th graduate student, because he's already placed 24 other students in academic jobs, and where are you going to go? North Dakota or something like that. So you want to, and so I was Salvador Luria's first PhD student. So I went into essentially a field which before other people were doing it. Okay. Another good rule for for becoming a scientist, and I saw my PhD period as a way of teaching you how to do science, not to do great science, but how to do it, was always sit in the front row. That is, in the front row, if you don't understand something, you should just say you don't understand. If you sit in the back row, no one will hear you and you'll be tempted not to. But if you're in the front row and you just don't understand it, say you don't understand. And you'll find that probably most people in the rows behind you don't understand. They like you for actually, stopping someone from not saying anything. Okay, so those were, and then another rule, which is, don't work on a PhD thesis unless you think it's important. You could, it's much easier to work on a weekend if you actually think what you're doing is important, not just a confirmation in another organism of a result, which is, when you know what result you're supposed to get. Okay. And another thing, you should do when you're getting a PhD is, be broader than your PhD thesis. Too many students just, become totally consumed with their PhD thesis, don't go to other seminars, and really don't really prepare themselves for doing anything other than their PhD thesis. So, when you're getting a PhD, don't spend more than a third of your time on your thesis. Yeah. You should be going to lectures and learning something else, because most likely what you're working on is not that important. Okay? Because if it was that important, your thesis advisor shouldn't have put you on it. He should be doing it himself. Okay? Because, you don't want to put someone who's just learning to do science into a competitive rat race. You want to teach them how to do science. Okay. So, your interest should really be much broader than, another very good rule is work on Sundays. All right? The reason is, what else is there to do? Yeah. And so, you should only not work when you don't have something better to do. Like in August, the end of the summer. You should not work in August. Yeah, it's a pretty good rule. But work in June and July. But August, suddenly the weather is going to disappear, and then take a 3-week vacation. You'll probably get bored after 2 weeks and ready to come back. But a week isn't long enough. And another good rule as a student is to exercise. Really play games. You physically get tired. And, toward the end of the day, not at the beginning of the day. Yeah. If you really play hard tennis at 9 in the morning, you're out by, at noon. But exercise cheers you up even when you have no reason to be cheered up. And, when you're doing experiments, you've got to expect most of the time it won't work. So you've got to have something which induces endorphins regularly. And, alcohol is not good. Yeah, it'll take away the anxiety, but, it's not as good as exercise because, you'll get a hangover. I remember the year I was in Copenhagen, they got drunk every Friday night, really drunk. So Saturday was a write-off. You should never be in that position. Okay, so this is talking about getting into being a scientist. Assume you actually know, how to do an experiment, and then you're ready for a postdoc. Okay. So by the time I finished my degree, I wanted to work on DNA. And so I went to Copenhagen because the biochemist Kalkar said he was going to work on DNA synthesis, but then when I got there, he was working on nucleosides. Very boring. I mean, you could work on how you made nucleosides and never learn anything about the gene. So I was saved finally by, hearing a talk by Morris Wilkins, and he showed a three-dimensional X-ray picture of DNA. And it was quite clear, if you couldn't ask how something was copied. The big question is, what was the gene, and how could you copy genetic information? Okay. And so that was the big one. But, when I was in graduate school, no one was really working on it. But it was the important problem. So if you want to sort of, really make your mark in science, you should work on something without too much competition. By that is, get into something where there may be at most 2 or 3 labs working on it. If there's no one working on it, maybe that's a little dangerous, okay? But if there are 10, the chance of your winning the race is very low. Okay. Whereas there's 2 or 3 that, the other people may stumble. So you have a chance to win a 3-person race, but not much of a chance to work a 10-person. So work on sort of the most important thing you can, which is not yet filled with people. Okay? All right, so that's first thing. Second is, don't work on something unless you think you're going to get a real answer in 3 to 5 years, preferably 3 years. No one's going to give you 10 years to not succeed. But generally, they'll give you 3. So you should have a potential route to success within 3 years. So if you don't know how to, you've got a mountain and you don't really know how you're going to get, you can't even plot a way to get to the top, stay away from it. Okay. Now, in the case of DNA, to most people it seemed too difficult. But Linus Pauling, that year in 1951, had correctly, proposed the alpha helix. And he didn't do it by crystallographic analysis. He did it by just saying what shape should a polypeptide fold up into, assuming that hydrogen bonds link them. And he needed one fact, which wasn't generally known, that the peptide bond was planar. With that fact, it was a totally solvable problem. And so he just had to think like a chemist. So I thought, if Pauling can guess the structure of the polypeptide chain, why can't we guess the structure of the polynucleotide chain? So what was going to be the key? And initially, we didn't know the key. In the alpha helix, it was the planar peptide bond. And people in Cambridge went to Leonard Jones, who was a professor of theoretical chemistry, and asked him whether the peptide bond should be planar, and he said he didn't know. So they didn't make it planar. They asked the wrong person. They asked only one person. So Francis and I, from the moment we started building models, we thought we might get the answer the next day. So we essentially thought we had a way to do it. Now, our first thing is, I recounted in the double helix was totally wrong because we didn't get the right principle. Okay. Now, the next sort of rule is work with a teammate who's sort of equal intelligence. That is, if you're really going to the frontier, like into New Guinea or something, you might not come back. So you want to, you don't want to climb the mountain alone. You just want to have one other person there. So if something is difficult, try and find someone to work with. Don't do it alone. I mean, it reassures you, when you don't know how to proceed, that the other person may not be as gloomy as yours. Okay. So without Francis, and I guess Francis without me, we wouldn't have done it. So we basically talked to each other for 18 months. Most of the time not saying anything relevant. But, we were... and we complimented each other in that my chief advantage was I didn't think there was anything worth working on except the three-dimensional structure of DNA. Francis was doing a PhD thesis on rather dull protein crystallography. So, but Francis really knew the theory, and so I certainly would have not done it without Francis. The fourth rule is never be the brightest person in the room. Okay. Now you would say, well, Francis always knew he was the brightest person in the room. He wasn't, because he didn't know any chemistry. And there were better X-ray people in Cambridge. So he always had someone he could test an idea with. So if you're the best chemist in your department, you have to ask maybe you're in the wrong department. So, and Cambridge University, at the time we were there, all in all, it was certainly in biology, it was the best university in the world. So you could say both Francis and I went there because Cambridge was good, and then we found each other. So if you go to a very good place, you'll probably find other people who went there just because it's good. And then the fifth rule was talk to your competition. It's so easy to sort of imagine your competitors to be bad people, evil people, crooked people. But they're the only people you can talk to. I could talk to Francis, and after a while we had nothing to say to each other. But when I went to Morris Wilkins, I learned something. Okay. So if I hadn't, and Francis couldn't go up to London without writing a letter to, that's why being an American helped me. He couldn't go up to see Wilkins without being invited. Couldn't spontaneously show up at King's. It wasn't done. So he would write Morris a letter. I'm coming up to London, will you be free? That sort of thing. Whereas when I got the Pauling manuscript, I didn't write to Morris, would you like to see it? I took it up. Okay? And when I took the Pauling manuscript, which, was the one where he proposed a three-train structure held together by hydrogen bonds between phosphate groups. Yeah, when you think about it, a loony idea because there were no hydrogens attached to the phosphate groups. So there was nothing to hold them together. That when we saw that manuscript, we thought, either Linus had made a chemical insight that none of us had had, or it was just crazy. Well, it was crazy, which you wouldn't have guessed. That was another advantage. When we saw the Pauling manuscript, we took it to Alex Todd and said, is there any chance? No. He said, no. So, now, Pauling failed, one, because he had a really stupid collaborator. You always say Pauling and Corey. Well, Corey would never criticize anything Linus did. He was there to calculate the coordinates. Put it together. Do Linus's shit work. Okay. The only person that Linus at that time spoke to was his wife. Everyone else was beneath him. Linus had reached the stage where basically he was in effect a god. and no one criticizes God, and he didn't want to be criticized. Okay. So, his wife probably criticized him, but not about chemistry. Now, there was a very fateful thing when, after the Biochemical Congress in 1951, Linus came to it. I met him, and we talked about the DNA structure. And so he sort of said, I'm going to work on it. Upon his return, he was on the same boat with Erwin Chargaff. Yes, the same boat. Pauling didn't like Chargaff. Now, Chargaff was totally unpleasant, and there was reason not to like him. Yeah. But can you imagine? He talked to Chargaff. Chargaff would have said, I have this strange thing. The amount of adenine is almost equal to the amount of thymine. One is equal to cytosine. And Pauling would have said they bond 1-to-1 to each other. So, you believe it, you could not write a novel in which you had them both on the same boat and they didn't talk about what supposedly interested them. Now, you can't say the reason that Pauling didn't is he wasn't that interested in DNA. It was just another problem to solve. He wasn't obsessive about it. Okay, that's first. Now, there was another case where Rosalind Franklin had the space group for the DNA, and she went up to Oxford to ask Dorothy Hodgkin what space group could be. And she went up and was not really, she wasn't a crystallographer, she was a physical chemist, and proposed and said that among the possible space groups were two which had mirror symmetry. Dorothy she couldn't believe that Rosalind would not know that there was no mirror symmetry in biology, and told her to go and talk about space groups in the next room with Jack Dunitz, a very, very Scottish-trained crystallographer whose career ended in Zurich. Very, very bright person. So Jack talked to Rosalind about space groups, and she never, ever talked to Dorothy about it. Nor did she ever go back to Oxford. If she had spent 20 minutes with Francis and told him the space groups, you could say you're giving away secret information, Francis would have said that it's two chains running in opposite directions. Because the same space group was in his hemoglobin crystals. So you could say, well, why didn't Rosalind do it? Well, I think the chief reason, she probably didn't like 3 dimensions. Whereas Francis really was a whiz in 3 dimensions. And then you could say, well, why? And I think Rosalind herself, DNA was a problem, but she was in no way obsessive about it. It was given to her. Randall said, work on it. She was, as a physical chemist, she didn't have the realization this is the most important problem in the world. I don't think she ever thought that way. She just, wanted to do it by herself. Now, I think, why didn't she want to talk to people? I think she was partly autistic. And really just wasn't comfortable with other people until she, knew them quite well. Her initial reaction was always negative. And, we'll never know. But after she had her second operation for cancer, she went and stayed with the Craigs. She liked Francis. That's why. But she, the initial thing was we were competition. So you really got to, realize, and then you could say, well, it's dangerous talking to your competition, but when you don't know what to do, why not? So if I hadn't taken the DNA paper because I wanted to talk to Morris, and Rosalind really got very angry at me when I said, Francis says you're wrong, it's a helix. Morris would have never gone in the room and picked out the B photograph and shown it to me. So if I hadn't talked to my competitors, I wouldn't be here. So just talk to your competitors. And then, what you do when, one person wins and one loses. I had forgot it. I don't know why I forgot it. Morris never forgot it. When he came up to Cambridge, it was terribly awkward because we knew we had it. And poor Morris was, not working on DNA until Rosalind left, and the dark lady finally left, and he was going to work on DNA, and we told him we have the answer. So we asked Morris to put his name on the paper. So it would have been, we said, it would have been a Watson, Crick, Wilkins, or whatever. We threw the dice, and which is why my name came first. So Morris said no, and then he said he remembered all his life as the worst mistake in his life of not putting his name on the paper. So, but it would have just been wrong not to ask him to. And then when the Nobel Prize came, fortunately, Sir Lawrence Bragg saw it and told the Swedes, you got out of sense of right and wrong, include Morris, because it was actually Morris had the crystalline thing. He had the space group. It was before Rosalind went in. But he didn't work out. Okay. So those are my rules. The last rule is always have someone to save you if you don't win. So never be in a position when there's no one to give you another job. So don't go off to the frontier if no one cares whether you come back. Okay.
Jim, thank you for that characteristically candid view of how to be a scientist. Let me just point out for the benefit of the audience that it is an entire coincidence that we're wearing the same tie today. It was not coordinated. I want to come back to some of the things you've said a moment ago, but can I start by bringing you right up to date and say you've just had your own genome sequenced. As Sir Richard said, you're not prepared to publish some of it because it might give away too much about you. But can you give us a few hints of what's written in your DNA?
I really don't know. When I went out to Houston and they were going to show me my thing, they said you have variation in 300 disease-causing genes. And 25 of them are in bad spots. So I immediately thought how lucky I was I didn't know this when I was 20. And so, they then in reflection, there was only one that first worried me because I carried the famous BRAC1. I had a variation in that. And now I didn't worry about myself, but my grandmother died of ovarian cancer, and my sister had got an inflammatory breast cancer at under 50. And so I thought probably my sister's daughters could be carriers, and I should tell them. But before I did, I got in touch with Mary Claire King, who'd worked on this gene before. It was owned by Myriad. And asked her to look at it to confirm that my variant was bad, and she looked at it and said it's not bad. So I'm left not knowing whether I should call my nieces. I think I will call them and say that as far as we can tell, the variation isn't one that would, prudence say they should get tested for BRAC1. But probably they should. Why not?
Has that changed your view about the importance of doing as much genetic testing as possible? You on the whole believe that that genetic testing is a good thing and that people should be allowed to do it, even if it's for ethically controversial things like IQ or something?
Yeah, I think everyone should have the right to look at their own genome. The one gene I said I didn't want to know was the apolipoprotein E because my Irish grandmother died at the age of 94 of Alzheimer's. And she got it in her late 80s. So I'm not in my late 80s yet. So I have 1 in 4 chance of having that.
And you don't want to know?
I don't want to know because, until Glaxo has the right drug. That is, I'd rather just, I'm an optimist. So, I will assume I'm not going to get it. And, but they called me up, before I knew they were going to write the paper. They said, did they want to block out any other genes they thought I might not want to know about? I said no. Because you could have a bad gene, but then there would be another gene which would protect you. I have about 5 cancer-causing potential ones, which, it's hard to know the risk. A cytochrome, why? Who knows? And, but I could have protective factors. And so my genome cost, if you bought the reagents for $454, $1 million. Celexa is going to, if that works, it'll be down to 100,000. And 454 is going to reduce the cost. So soon it's going to be down to about, I hope, American terms is Chevrolet cost. Chevrolet isn't that fine a car. So, if you can get your genome done instead of buy a Chevrolet for your son, you have a choice. And, but when that happens, where, you would immediately want to sequence 1,000 heavy smokers who have reached 80 and not got lung cancer or emphysema, and try and see what the protective factor is.
Yeah, the danger is all the information is bad news, that you've got potential cancer causing.
Yeah, but we don't know enough about non-cancer causing genes.
Yeah.
And there are genes which will protect you against cancer. The most important one is chromosome 21, ignored by the entire cancer research community. People with Downs only get testicular cancer and leukemias. They do not get most cancers. Why? So there are one group of people who are protected. So these people who smoke, they've got to be protected. So, that leads that we want to sequence to start with. I think only old, successful people. And by successful, that they still function in their 80s. To see good genomes. And so if people are healthy, then, they won't really, as I tried to say, not sleeping because of your genome when you should not be sleeping because of Iraq. I mean, Iraq is really bad, whereas I don't know that my genome is really bad. So worry about something you should have reason to worry about, So I haven't lost, I think, a minute's sleep of seeing my genome. And so I'm really excited by the fact. And we won't really know how to interpret genomes until you do thousands of them. And it'll be much better if we actually know people rather than just statistics. So I'm hoping there'll be a lot of people, either out of vanity or curiosity or just because they're very rich, will do it. And I think it's going to go very fast. Yeah.
Can I take you back then to some of your rules about how to do important science? One of the most striking features of your career is that you start very early. You're at university at the age of 15. You have a PhD at 22. You whiz around the world trying to find someone who will do an important problem with you, and you keep having to move on because they're not as interested as you in other things. and then suddenly you find Francis Crick. What is it about him that I mean, you told me once that within half an hour of meeting him, you had decided he was the person you were going to collaborate with?
He's logical, you know. Yeah, he was just, you know, there was no one in Cambridge interested in it when he got there in DNA.
But his reputation at the time was as a 35-year-old mediocrity who's laughed
No, that's not true. I mean, his Perutz and Kendrew thought Francis was very bright. In the Admiralty, Harry Macy and Colin thought Francis was very bright.
But he hadn't yet got a PhD, and he was
No,
35, and Bragg had threatened to sack him from Cavendish.
Yeah, but, you know, I mean, Perutz was very bright, in fact, much better than I initially thought. And, you know, because of his mannerisms, not, no, Francis just was, he talked fast, he was interested in lots of things, and he was always logical.
He once wrote that if Watson had been killed by a tennis ball, which was quite a realistic possibility because you played a lot of tennis, I know I would never have discovered the structure of DNA, but I'm not sure who would. He was well aware that it was you were the catalyst.
Yeah, I was the catalyst and he was the brains. And so, you know, just seek out brains. I mean, it's the best way for success. Just seek out brains.
But then,
you know...
later in your parallel careers, you had moments when you fell out with each other quite badly.
No,
particularly when you wrote
I
the Double
think in
Helix.
the 10 years after the Double Helix, which I devoted unsuccessfully to finding a girlfriend, and Francis successfully devoted to working on the genetic code, I was a little jealous of Francis. You know, he seemed to be, everyone thought he was the bright one. In fact, Sir Lawrence Bragg, you know, wrote me a letter, in fact, he didn't know I was writing the Double Helix, saying that I should write my account, because I think he was afraid that anyone who talked to Francis would think I was, you know, like Pauling and Corey, you know, Watson and Crick, that, you know, I was just the tame biologist. Right. Whereas I was probably, you know, I always, you know, was raised on the belief that really bright people can do mathematics, and then those who can't do biology. And so, you know, that's why I did biology. You know, so I probably, you know, paid more, you know, unduly put mathematical ability as, you know, only people with mathematical ability are really, whereas the trouble with people with mathematical ability, at least half of them are autistic, and so they aren't very worldly. And so there's a role for people who aren't mathematicians. And so, I mean, you can't, I mean, you know, in a few cases, you can't imagine a mathematician as a leader. You know, they just don't think about humans. Whereas Francis, of course, wasn't a mathematician. I mean, he knew some, but you know, there were, you know, people who knew more. And so Francis's solution of the helical theory, he didn't do the elegant math. It was done by someone else, and that was an equivalent thing.
When you wrote your book, which initially you called Honest Jim,
yes.
Your first sentence was, "I've never seen Francis Crick in a modest mood."
Yeah. Well,
and when you sent him a manuscript of it in 1967, he replied that it was the sort of history found in the lower class of women's magazines. That if you published, you would be invading his privacy, violating his friendship, and history would condemn you. You went ahead.
Yeah, because I didn't think
What was that all about?
I didn't. No, France. enough people also read the manuscript who said it didn't harm Francis, and they liked Francis. They didn't think the book in any way harmed him. I didn't think it harmed him, and it was just a good first sentence. And any book, even a textbook, has to slightly exaggerate, make it simpler than it is in order to to teach. So. Once I had the first sentence, I knew how to write the book. Until you have a good first sentence, you don't often know what you're going to emphasize. So, and then, within a year of it, Francis, admitted he got invited to dinner parties he wouldn't have because I'd written the book. So the book actually never hurt him at all.
He said something very interesting a few years afterwards. He said that he hadn't realized until he saw the reception of your book that it was necessary to tell the world that scientists were human beings.
Yeah, Francis had a very sort of...
Is it necessary to tell the world that scientists are human beings? So that actually when you're doing great experiments you make mistakes, you play tennis, you chase girls, whatever it is?
I think that's what... Science is very social. And, Rosalind Franklin couldn't socialize. It was an enormous disadvantage to her. Francis could socialize very well, and that was a great advantage. People liked to be around Francis.
Throughout your career, you've also...
Francis, it's hard, to have a... he was, the dominant influence in my life, and but in reflection, he had limitations. I'm very happy, getting my thrills through chocolate ice cream, whereas Francis had to turn to LSD. It's too bad. And so Francis spent a lot of time with, seedy people. I couldn't understand. But he sort of, I don't know why. And then Francis wasn't a biologist, and we're going to do neuroscience, and I said I thought the Drosophila was the best system, and he said it didn't have a hippocampus. Who cares? The fly still, can do things. So it's one of the really rules is that there's very seldom you'll meet someone who doesn't have enormous limitations in one form or other. They're 90% efficient or 80%. And Francis was, 10% kook.
Moving on to relationships with other people, you've not been afraid to make enemies during your career.
No, some people are just harmful, and you've got to beat them. The main thing is to beat them. And generally, you don't beat them alone. You've got to, have, companions when you've got to take on something bad. Yeah. But life is not... the most interesting fact that I've learned this last year, which is probably not a good fact, it was by a British-trained criminologist, psychologist. He said that 3% of the people in this world are psychopaths. Okay? 3%. How many in this room? So that you're gonna meet them, and you've got to somehow prevail and not let them, best you because they have no sense of, human decency. But there are people out there, and you know, sometimes it's stupidity. You've got to defeat the stupidity. Sometimes you've got to defeat evil. But always, you know, I've always had enemies. And I think people who don't have any enemies don't really, you know, they're boring. because, you know, how can you not know that there's some people who are trying to thwart what you're trying to do? So,
in your own words, you felt queasy after discovering the double helix.
Well, I felt,
and you stopped doing a radio talk on the grounds that people thought you'd pirated data.
No. I felt, you know, that we'd won, and we shouldn't rub it in. That's, I guess, that was the simplest way. And, you know, I didn't want to rub it in on
But did you write the book partly to light the fuse of rehabilitating Rosalind Franklin's reputation?
No, not in the slightest.
Because to some
extent, I just wanted to tell the story.
You did.
I did, and you know, after we found the DNA structure, and Rosalind turned it to tobacco mosaic virus, which I had worked on when Bragg had told us not to work on that. So I was talking to Rosalind about TMB, and she was. I liked her. You know, once we passed out, nobody disliked Rosalind. But I wanted to tell the story the way it was, and people said, "Oh, you should." I said I wanted to write the book like a novel, and someone else would write it in a different way, and so I had to. You know, at the end, it was, I must confess, someone at Harvard University Press said, you've got to say something nice about Rosalind because at the end, and so I wrote that little epilogue, and which was, you know, would have been bad if I hadn't. But, so I was, you know, at the time you know, until we saw the manuscript in which she described the B form, we had no idea she'd even accepted a helix, that she was even thinking this way. Now, that was only, you know, about in the month before. So I didn't know really anything about her. I had no idea, you know, she'd gone to St. Paul's for girls. In fact, it was 5 years, I didn't even know until after she died that she came from a very wealthy family. I didn't know she was Jewish. I didn't know anything because she didn't let me know much about her. I mean, you know, she was not welcoming me, I mean, at the beginning. And, you know, I must have been, you know, people did describe I was a bit odd. Because Max Brod said I never would do busy work. You know, I never would do something which wasn't going to do anything, just to pass time, you know. And so I stood out as someone who just was on the fringe and never doing anything, listening, instead of, you know, trying to help other people or anything like that. But yeah, I've tried later in my life when, you know, to have a bigger cause, but at that time, you know, people would say, well, you know, I wasn't very nice. All I cared about was the DNA structure. And that's all I cared about. I mean, it was aided by the fact that effectively there were no girls in Cambridge. So, you know, there was nothing, you know, I didn't want to think about men, and I didn't think about men, so, you know, what do you think about? DNA. So, you know, so, I mean, Cambridge that exists now is a much harder place to do great science. I mean, you know, it really is. I mean, the Eagle is a date place now. Whereas the Eagle, when I was there, you know, we never saw a woman at King's. I mean, in the Eagle. I mean, it was homosexuals from King's. I mean, that's really what, you know, that's what the Eagle was. And perfect place to get science done.
Did Jeff Goldblum do a good job of portraying
the tennis was bad.
His tennis was bad.
Yeah, and yeah, after a while, I think, you know, I see the movie now. He did a good job because he made me orthogonal to everyone else. And I was at the time. I was not, my parents never said I had to be polite to anyone or anything like that. It was never a virtue. So now I guess I could end by saying that in my current book, I have found someone I know who should play me.
Oh yeah, who's that?
Sacha Baron Cohen. I mean, you could imagine it would be very funny, but it will catch essentially it could be a very funny movie about Harvard and, going to tea at the president's house and,
You heard it here first.
But,
Ladies and gentlemen, should we try and take one or two quick questions from the audience? We've only got another 5 minutes left. Sir.
If I may, just two quick questions. The first one is, have you ever stopped wondering at the marvel of the simplicity and beauty of the film?
I guess it was what it had to be because life had to get started. We never used that argument very much, that it couldn't be too complicated or it wouldn't have got started. You needed something like base pairing as a universal way of copying information. So I think once I thought that way, no, it's, the way it had to start. I don't think much about that. It's always the next problem. What are you going to do next? And, the weekend that we found the structure, that was, and I was slightly scared that it could be so pretty and not true. Could you not fit the X-ray data? And then we got the pucker of the sugar wrong, and it didn't superficially fit the X-ray data. But, it just had the smell that no one could, imagine one polypeptide chain being copied into something other. This really, when you got down to it, was it.
Who would like the microphone? It's halfway up there.
And is there any logical reason why...
Just wait for the microphone so the others can hear.
The second one, a question which for me is more important in a way. Is there any logical reason why the genetic code is always being represented in the order 1, 2, 3 and not 2, 1, 3?
Someone has sent me a manuscript saying you were the one. Okay, now I understand. Yeah, no, it has. Okay. Yeah. So, which is nice. There's still truths out there to be found, and people who are clever chemists really are the ones who can think about how life got started, which is a very big thing. Whether we will ever know.
It wouldn't work as 3, 2, 1 because of wobble.
No,
yeah. Two, yeah.
If it's more like 2, 1, 2.
Sure.
Anyway, we better move on.
Yeah, we can have some. Yeah.
Who else wants to ask a question? I can't see any more hands.
No, sure.
There's one. Just wait for the microphone, if you would.
If science is truly social, do we organise our universities in the right kind of way?
Could you repeat that? My hearing.
Oh, I'm sorry. If science is truly social, do we organise our universities in the right way?
Well, I think we probably do, but the trouble is most of our teachers are slightly Asperger's. I've thought about that a lot, as to why are academics so petty and unrealistic? And they really just, can't think in terms of other people. And so there's, I think, a real selection. You say, oh, I can't make it in business. And so academia is a place where only ideas matter. But you've got to convince people of other ideas. You've got to talk to other people to refine your ideas. And in a way, you've got to try and know how you're going to keep an audience with you for an hour. I mean, that's a hard job. To really
But do we make enough time for what you did with Francis, which was talk?
Yeah, I think there's plenty of time, but we're probably. I never had a course on how to be a good teacher or anything like that. I think to be a good teacher, one, you've got to actually enjoy what you're teaching. It's got to do it, which means you shouldn't give the same course for 20 years in a row, and probably 5 years is the limit to which you can probably stay excited, move on to something. I think, if there's any fault with our system, is that we talk too much about the past with our students, rather than really trying to put ourselves in their position of asking what are they going to actually do when they go out there, and what should they really know if they go out there in order to succeed. And so
we should stress.
I think, at Cold Spring Harbor, we probably don't prepare our postdocs or the people with what are the big problems you should solve, and what's your chance of solving them. Where can you go in neuroscience? What can you do now? And so on. Instead, we talk to them about what we have a pretty good picture of, and not of what's messy. Whereas out there, it's going to be messy. I mean, one of my rules was never learn anything unless you will use it within 2 years.
Well,
yeah, which I think is a pretty good rule, because you're just wasting your time learning something you won't use. So why learn it? But schools don't think this way. They want you to get. So I think the main fault with education now is it takes too long, because the field has got so complex. They say the average age of people getting their first NIH grant is 42 now. 42. You're an old man. And you're getting your first grant. So what you really, whereas I think the brain peaks around 20, about the same age it peaks in tennis. And, and you get wisdom afterwards. But you waste so much of your really time when you're good, learning things you don't have to know, or doing things that really aren't worth doing. And universities aren't really tough enough to ask, does this make sense? So, I know in England you had 3-year degrees. Now you've got to add more fourth, but I think people, from about 25 on should really feel they're not working for anyone else. Right. Whereas you got a system now which people are seemingly go on to 35 and they're still taking orders. So it's partly saying, well, we're now going to live to be 90, so we're going to extend everything. Yeah, that's what we're doing.
Well, ladies and gentlemen,
rather than more or less say that the 25, really, your brain is very good if you're given the responsibility and you don't spend too much time learning things you won't use, which it sort of says you've got to have a good undergraduate education so that your graduate education doesn't just go on and on and on. And then you get stuck into postdocs for years after years after years. And again,
Well, I'm worried about us running out of time now because I think we've trespassed on.
Sure, okay, but one more question if someone has,
Well, I
or
think
you want to stop?
I think we
Fine.
probably should.
There's one question.
There's
now.
one.
Take
Good.
one
We've
more.
got a good.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Do you believe when humankind will have understand DNA completely that there will be still a little bit where we won't have the clue about? And I'm not talking about chewing gum.
Matt, did you hear?
Do you believe that when we understand DNA completely, will there be anything left that we don't understand? Is that roughly right?
Well, I guess a straight answer, women.
I think on that note, Jim, thank you very much indeed.
It's not possible to beat that. James, could I, on our behalf, thank you so much, and Elizabeth for joining us on this evening, which I am sure all of us has found to be most enjoyable and most exciting. The idea of Borat playing you in the next film is something to behold. On our behalf, I'd like to thank Justin Cobb and Aradazi, who were responsible for organising this event this evening. I'd also like to thank the Events Office and the Division of Surgery, Oncology, Reproduction and Anaesthetics. I think you have agreed to sign some books outside after this, so if you want to get your signed copies. But James, it just remains for me to thank you on behalf of Imperial College for a most enjoyable and interesting last hour. Ladies and gentlemen, James Watson.